A long table stretched across the center of the luxurious room. Leather chairs, expensive liquor. Several expensive cigars burned slowly throughout the room while smoke drifted lazily beneath the lantern light. Several well-dressed crime bosses sat around the massive table while armed guards stood behind them. Others quietly observed the newcomer from the shadows near the walls. The atmosphere immediately became tense. Several guards instantly raised revolvers toward Jack White. Others prepared magical attacks. Even the older man from earlier that month sat among them, the same man who had sold Lydia to him. The moment he recognized Jack White, his eyes narrowed sharply. Jack calmly glanced around the room, then smiled faintly. "Gentlemen," he said smoothly, "there's no need for unnecessary violence today. I'm merely here as a fellow businessman, a businessman who dislikes certain rules that prevent him from making money." A few of the men exchanged suspicious looks. Jack continued walking calmly toward the table, as if none of the weapons bothered him in the slightest. "But I also come with a unique proposal." One of the crime bosses suddenly leaned forward slightly. "You've got nerve walking in here." Jack looked toward him calmly. "Yes." The room fell quiet again. Then Jack slowly spread his hands slightly. "But before any of you decide to interrupt me, allow me to offer a little motivation." A faint grin crossed his face. "Tell me, does anyone here truly wish to shoot the goose that lays the golden eggs?" He paused briefly. "Or perhaps it was a chicken. I suppose that depends on who tells the story." A few confused looks spread across the room, but several others leaned back slightly, now curious despite themselves. Jack noticed immediately. "Well," he continued calmly, "I believe you're all curious about one thing. What exactly gives me the confidence to walk into a room filled with fine gentlemen such as yourselves, and what sort of idea I possess that would make me believe it's worthy of your attention?" The room remained silent. Jack gave a faint smile. "After all, if you weren't curious, your men would already be dragging me and my colleague outside, and we'd likely be taking a swim with the fishes." Several of the men gave small laughs. Even a few of the guards smirked faintly. Jack folded his hands behind his back calmly. "So, I take it you're willing to hear my proposition." One of the older crime bosses slowly gestured toward his men. The guards lowered their revolvers. Even several magical enforcers relaxed slightly. The older man leaned back in his chair. "Well then, the stage is yours. Explain this master plan of yours. And if we like it, well, we won't throw you into the river."
Jack White smiled faintly. "Oh, you're going to like this one." He slowly glanced toward Henrik. "But first, I believe a demonstration would be more appropriate." Henrik stepped forward calmly before opening the bag he had been carrying. A few moments later, he placed several stacks of paper notes onto the massive table. The room immediately grew quieter. Several of the crime bosses narrowed their eyes. Jack calmly picked up a few stacks before walking around the room. One by one, he handed several notes to each of the men seated at the table. Afterward, he calmly returned to his original position. "Now then," Jack said smoothly, "take a good look at what you're holding." The men glanced down at the notes. Some rubbed the paper between their fingers. Others held the notes closer to the lantern light. One of the men frowned slightly. "What exactly am I supposed to be looking at?" Jack smiled faintly. "Well, my first question is simple. Do you believe those are genuine notes?" One of the men looked back up at him. "Are you trying to bribe us?" Several others began laughing quietly. Jack gave a small grin. "No, but pay close attention to the notes. If you do, you'll notice something slightly out of place." The room slowly became quieter again as several of the men carefully inspected the currency. Time passed. Then, finally, one of them frowned. "I don't see anything wrong with it." Jack nodded calmly. "That's because you're not comparing it." He slowly gestured toward the man's wallet. "Take out a genuine note." The man hesitated briefly before pulling one from his wallet. "Now compare the identification markings, the letters and numbers." The men slowly looked back and forth between the notes, and then several expressions changed immediately. One of the men suddenly leant forward. "One number is missing." Jack smiled faintly. "Correct. This was merely for demonstration purposes. Otherwise, you would not have noticed the difference." The room fell silent again. Jack slowly folded his hands behind his back. "The paper is identical. The ink is identical. The texture is identical. And every detail has been replicated precisely. The only reason these notes differ is because I intentionally made them differ." Several men exchanged glances. Jack continued calmly. "You see, those identification markings were originally designed so the Empire could track how many notes were printed and compare them against the gold, silver, and bronze reserves backing the currency. But since I know the paper they use, the ink they use, and the exact process required to duplicate them, I believe you understand where this conversation is going." One of the crime bosses stared at him. "You're saying you can create exact copies?" Jack nodded once. "Yes." Another man leant forward slowly. "You're saying you can literally print money?" Jack gave a faint smile. "Yes."
The room became completely silent. Several of the men slowly looked back down at the notes in their hands. Jack calmly continued speaking. "But the real opportunity lies elsewhere. You see, what do you believe eventually happens when there are more paper notes in circulation than actual gold, silver, or bronze reserves backing them?" None of the men answered immediately. Jack continued calmly. "The Empire itself is likely already doing exactly that, printing more notes than they truly have reserves for. So, in reality, we are merely taking advantage of something that already exists, or perhaps we're simply accelerating it." Several of the crime bosses now listened much more carefully. Jack slowly paced beside the table. "Gold, silver, and bronze will always possess value. They must be mined, they must be extracted. They are difficult to produce in large quantities. But paper currency? That can be produced endlessly." He paused briefly. "So the true wealth lies here. We exchange the notes for gold, silver, and bronze. We quietly gather it, we store it, and eventually, people will begin losing trust in paper itself." A few of the older men slowly nodded. Jack noticed. "And when panic begins, people always return to what they trust: gold, silver, bronze. And when that happens, people will do almost anything for coins that still hold value." His voice remained calm, measured, controlled. "And that gives us leverage. It gives the crime families power, real power." One of the men slowly leaned back. "And if the Empire stabilizes things?" Jack shrugged slightly. "Then we still possess the gold. So either way, we profit." Another crime boss narrowed his eyes.
So why involve us at all? Clearly you could attempt this yourself. Jack smiled faintly. Yes, but that would create complications. He slowly gestured towards the notes. If one man repeatedly walks into banks exchanging large quantities of fresh notes, eventually someone becomes suspicious. But you already possess gambling houses, businesses, trade routes, smugglers, territories. You already move currency naturally. And if counterfeit notes are mixed together with genuine circulation, they blend in. The room remained silent. Jack continued calmly. Also, these notes still look fresh. Can you imagine someone walking into a bank with stacks of perfectly fresh notes? That alone would raise suspicion. But mixed with damaged notes, older notes, used notes, they become nearly impossible to detect. One of the older crime bosses slowly nodded. That actually makes sense. Jack gave a small smile. And now you understand why I require your assistance. You possess resources I do not, and those resources make this operation significantly easier. He paused briefly. So yes, I do believe every man in this room is interested. Several of the crime bosses slowly nodded almost instinctively.
One of the men narrowed his eyes slightly. And what exactly do you gain from all of this? Jack looked toward him calmly. A percentage, but I prefer my payment in gold, silver, or bronze, coins or bars if necessary, and I believe 40% is more than reasonable. A few men exchanged glances. One of them suddenly smirked. And what exactly stops us from removing you from the arrangement once we understand the process? The room became quiet again. Jack smiled faintly. A fair question. He slowly picked up one of the demonstration notes. You see, you can certainly attempt to replicate this yourselves. You can search for the correct paper. You can experiment with the ink. You can even attempt to duplicate the identification system. He slowly turned the note between his fingers. But all of that requires experimentation, trial and error, and every failed attempt increases the risk of attracting attention. He glanced around the room. After all, how long do you think it would take you to solve each one of those problems yourselves? None of them answered. Jack continued calmly. What I'm offering you is not merely the idea. I'm offering you the solution, the machine, the paper, the ink, the process, and most importantly, the identification combinations. Several of the crime bosses now stared at him much more seriously. Jack calmly reached into his coat before placing a small piece of paper on the table. Well, if you're interested, this contains the address where you may contact me tomorrow. We can discuss further arrangements there. The machines can either be collected or delivered. That depends entirely on your preference. He stepped back calmly. But for now, I believe I have interrupted your evening long enough. After all, I am still technically an uninvited guest. A few of the men chuckled quietly. Jack gave a polite nod. Good evening, gentlemen. Then he turned calmly and walked towards the doors. As Jack White exited the room alongside Henrik, one of the older crime bosses suddenly spoke from behind him. Interesting man. Jack simply smiled faintly without turning around. The heavy doors closed behind them. A few moments later, the two began descending the stairs. Once outside, Henrik gave a small signal. From farther down the street, Geshny and Darian quietly approached. Darian was the first to speak. Well, it seemed like everything went according to your plan, boss. Jack calmly adjusted one of his gloves. Yes, and I believe greed played exactly the role I expected it to. The group slowly began walking through the moonlit streets of Brasken. But, Jack continued calmly, I also now possess something of an insurance policy. Geshmy glanced toward him. You think they'll betray you eventually. Jack gave a faint smile. Yes, eventually. Greed rarely remains satisfied forever. And eventually, they may attempt to remove the person standing above them. He glanced briefly toward the distant river. And currently, that person is me. Darian frowned slightly. So what do we do when that happens? Jack continued walking calmly. We flip the table before they can. The others exchanged glances. Jack noticed. I'll explain when we return. The group continued through the quiet streets before eventually arriving back at the inn. As they kept walking, Jack White looked ahead calmly before speaking. Well, it's time to get in touch with Thomas Harlow. The others looked toward him. As they entered the inn, Darian frowned slightly. Thomas Harlow, you trust him? The group slowly moved upstairs. After a brief silence, they entered the room. Then Hendrik looked toward Jack. Are you sure you only need to work with him? Jack White gave a small smile. Well, who do you think has been providing much of the information we've recently been using? The room became quiet. He's not the only source. We gather information from multiple places, but he's been one of the biggest contributors. After all, he's one of the men I placed in charge of portions of the underground network. Jack calmly removed his gloves. And if things went according to plan, he may already have played the role I needed him to play. The others exchanged glances. Geshny frowned slightly. What exactly do you mean by that? Jack gave a faint smile. Let's just say, I already have an ace up my sleeve. More than that, you don't need to know right now. He slowly sat down. But for now, each one of you should get some proper rest. Tomorrow will be a busy day. He leaned back slightly in his chair. And besides, we still have other counterfeit currency to distribute across the country. I already established the men needed for that. So for now, everything else simply needs to fall into place. The others listened quietly. And also, I want to inspect a few properties and a few listings. I may require additional resources and other methods of transportation. He paused briefly. To make certain everything proceeds according to plan. The others slowly nodded. Then they eventually went their separate ways.